A woman kneels in the dirt beside her child. The boy is 5, maybe 6. His neck is swollen to the size of a fist, the skin stretched so tight it has turned the color of a bruise. He has not stopped shaking since midnight. She presses a damp rag to his forehead and whispers a prayer she has whispered 1,000 times before, but this time the words fall into an empty room. By dawn, the boy will be dead. By the following evening, the woman will feel the same heat rising in her own body. By the end of the week, the house will be empty, and no one will come to collect the bodies for 3 days because the men who used to do that work are also dead. This is London. The year is 1348, and what is happening inside this house is happening inside every third house on the street. The disease kills fast. It begins with a fever so sudden that some victims collapse mid-sentence. Then come the swellings, hard, dark lumps the size of eggs erupting in the groin, the armpits, behind the ears. The medieval world calls them buboes. Within hours, black spots bloom across the skin, hemorrhages beneath the surface, the body destroying itself from the inside. Some victims vomit blood. Almost all are dead within 72 hours. There is no treatment. There is no understanding. There is only the terror of watching your own body betray you in a way no priest, no physician, and no prayer can reverse. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio watches the plague consume his city and records what he sees. Swellings the size of an ordinary apple, black spots on every part of the body, brother abandoning brother, parents refusing to tend their own children, corpses dumped into mass trenches, one on top of another like a ship's cargo. In Ireland, a monk named John Klyn watches his brothers die one by one and keeps writing. Near the end, he leaves a note in the margin. "I leave parchment to continue this work, if perchance any man survive." The next entry is in a different hand. Klyn is dead. This is not a famine. Famines are slow. This is not a war. Wars have fronts and truces. This is something the medieval world has no framework for. A pandemic that will cross every border in Europe, kill between 25 and 50 million people, and break the civilization it leaves behind. The story begins far from London. For centuries, trade routes connecting Europe and Asia, the overland Silk Road, and the maritime corridors through the Black Sea and Mediterranean had carried silk, spices, and gold across continents. In the 1340s, they carried something else. In 1346, the Mongol Golden Horde under Khan Janibek besieged Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Black Sea coast of Crimea. His army was powerful, but his soldiers were dying, not from battle, but from a sickness that swelled their bodies and blackened their skin. Janibek ordered their corpses loaded onto catapults and hurled over the city walls. The decomposing bodies crashed into Kaffa's streets. The infection spread. The Genoese merchants fled by ship, sailing west toward home, but the plague sailed with them, in the rats nesting among cargo, in the fleas carrying a bacterium that would not be identified for another 5 centuries, Yersinia pestis. The ships reached Sicily in October 1347. Within weeks, the dying began. From Sicily to Marseille, from Genoa to Florence, from Venice to Rome, each city fell in turn. telling the same story: swellings, black spots, mass graves, collapse. By the summer of 1348, the plague crossed the English Channel. A ship from Gascony docked at Malcolm Regis on the Dorset coast. At least one sailor aboard was already infected. Bristol fell in August. The living were scarce able to bury the dead. And then, in September, the Black Death reached London. It arrived without drama. No alarm bell, no herald at the gates. The plague entered the city the way it entered every city, silently, on the backs of rats, in the cargo holds of ships, through the docks and warehouses lining the Thames. London, 80 to 100,000 people crammed into narrow streets, overhanging timber buildings and open sewers, was the perfect host. For the first weeks, most Londoners noticed nothing. The markets along Cheapside were still loud. The bells of 100 parish churches still rang the hours. Children played in the mud. Taverns filled by mid-afternoon. Rumors of a great sickness in the south had reached the city, but rumors of distant catastrophe were permanent background noise in the 14th century. The Great Famine was still within living memory. People had survived that. They assumed they would survive this. Then, in a house near the wharves, a man felt a sudden warmth in his chest. By morning, a hard lump had appeared beneath his arm. By the next day, dark blotches covered his forearms. By the third morning, his wife was screaming for a priest. Within a week, his neighbors were sick. Within a month, the parish yard was full. Within 2 months, they were digging mass trenches. London had no defense. Its physicians understood disease as an imbalance of the body's 4 humors. They prescribed bloodletting, herbal compresses, and vinegar-soaked sponges, treatments that did nothing and sometimes hastened death. The physicians themselves, forced close to their patients, were among the first to fall. The church fared no better. Priests entering sick rooms to deliver last rites breathed the same air, touched the same skin, and carried the disease to the next house. Entire monasteries emptied. In some parishes, every priest died. And the people prayed. With an intensity born of absolute terror, they attended masses, joined processions, fasted, confessed, purchased relics and charms. It made no difference. The plague killed the faithful and the sinful with the same indifference. And that was perhaps the deepest wound of all, not just the physical horror of the disease, but the discovery that the entire framework upon which they had built their understanding of reality did not work. By the spring of 1349, London had lost between 1/3 and half of its population. Across England, some villages lost 80% of their inhabitants. Others vanished entirely. Tusmore, Tilgarsley, and dozens more whose names survive only in property deeds, because there was no one left to write them down. The total death toll, 2 to 3 million dead out of the population of 5 million in roughly 18 months. And yet the survivors did not disappear. They buried their dead, reopened the markets, replanted the fields. But the world they rebuilt was not the world they had known. Too much was broken. Too many of the people who had maintained the old structures were in the ground. The Black Death did not just kill people. It killed a world. And from the corpse of that world, another one slowly, painfully, invisibly began to be born. But to understand what the plague shattered, we first need to understand the machine it found, a system built on obedience, bound by tradition, and powered by an endless supply of human bodies willing to do what they were told. That system was called feudalism, and in 1348, it was the only world anyone in England had ever known. The world the plague found in 1348 was not fragile by accident, it was fragile by design. For 3 centuries before the Black Death arrived, English society had operated on a single organizing principle. Everyone had a place, and no one was permitted to leave it. The king owned all land. He granted portions of it to his barons and earls in exchange for military service and loyalty. The nobles, in turn, divided their holdings into manors and estates worked by peasants, most of whom were not free. They were serfs, bound to the soil they plowed from the day they were born until the day they died. A serf could not leave the manor without permission. He could not marry without his lord's consent. He could not send his son to school, sell his grain at a market of his choosing, or travel to the next village to seek better wages. He belonged to the land, and the land belonged to the Lord, and the Lord answered to the king. This was the feudal system, and in 1348 it was so deeply embedded in the fabric of English life that most people could not imagine any alternative, the way a fish cannot imagine a world without water. The hierarchy was absolute. At the top sat the king, Edward III, a warrior monarch in his mid-30s who had already launched England into the catastrophic conflict with France that would later be called the 100 Years' War. Below the king, the great barons and earls held vast estates across the countryside. Below them, lesser lords and knights managed individual manors. Below them, a thin layer of freemen, merchants, skilled craftsmen, minor landholders occupied an uneasy middle ground. And below everyone else, forming roughly 80 to 90% of the entire population, were the peasants. Their lives were defined by labor. A peasant family rose before dawn and worked until the light failed. They plow the Lord's fields before they could tend their own strips of land. They paid rent, not in money, which they rarely possessed, but in grain, eggs, chickens, days of additional labor. They paid the church a tithe, 1/10 of everything they produced in wheat, barley, or whatever their land yielded. After the Lord took his share and the church took its 1/10, what remained was often barely enough to survive. In a good year, a peasant family ate dark bread, pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables were available, some cheese, and perhaps a little salted meat. In a bad year, they ate less. In a very bad year, they starved. And bad years were becoming more common. England by the 1340s was a country stretched to its limits. The population had been growing steadily since the 11th century, reaching perhaps 5 to 6 million by the early 1300s, a number that the agricultural technology of the time could barely sustain. Nearly every available acre of arable land was under cultivation. Forests had been cleared, marshes had been drained. Even marginal land, thin soil on steep hillsides, boggy ground that flooded every spring was being farmed because there were simply too many mouths and not enough food. Then came the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. 7 years of relentless rain destroyed harvests across northern Europe. Crops rotted in the fields, livestock drowned or starved. The price of grain tripled, then quadrupled. People ate dogs, cats, bark, and, according to some accounts, each other. In England alone, an estimated 10% of the population died. The survivors were weakened, malnourished, and more vulnerable to disease than they had been in generations. The famine ended, but the population never fully recovered its strength. And then, just 15 years later, the 100 Years' War began, draining away men, money, and resources. England in 1348 was not a nation at its peak. It was a nation already running on fumes. But nowhere was the strain more visible than in London. The city in the 1340s was a place of extraordinary density and extraordinary filth. 80 to 100,000 people were packed inside a walled area of roughly 1 square mile. The streets were narrow, some barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, and lined with timber-framed buildings that leaned towards each other as they rose, their upper stories almost touching overhead, blocking out the sky. The ground beneath was unpaved, a churned mixture of mud, animal dung, kitchen scraps, and the slow drainage from open gutters that ran down the center of every lane. The smell was the first thing any visitor noticed. Butchers slaughtered animals in their shops and dumped the offal into the street. Tanners soaked hides in vats of urine. Dyers poured chemical waste into the nearest ditch. Chamber pots were emptied from upper windows, sometimes with a warning shout, sometimes not. The Thames, which served simultaneously as the city's water supply, its main commercial highway, and its sewer, was thick with waste. Fish still lived in it. People still drank from it. But it was, by any modern standard, an open cesspool running through the heart of the capital. And everywhere, there were rats. They lived in the walls of houses, in the thatched roofs, in the grain stores and cellars, in the straw bedding where families slept. They were so common that no one thought of them as remarkable. They were simply part of the texture of city life, like mud, like smoke, like the sound of church bells. No one connected them to disease. No one understood that the fleas on their bodies were carrying a bacterium that would within months begin killing at a rate that no war, no famine, and no previous epidemic had ever matched. Above this density of bodies and filth, the church loomed, not just spiritually, but physically. London had more than 100 parish churches, plus monasteries, priories, friaries, and the great cathedral of St. Paul's. The church controlled education, charity, hospitals, and much of the city's land. It administered the sacraments that marked every transition of human life: baptism, marriage, last rites. It collected tithes from every household. It was the ultimate authority on questions of morality, meaning, and truth. When something went wrong, a crop failure, a stillbirth, a plague, the church had an explanation. God was displeased. The remedy was always the same: prayer, penance, and obedience. This was not questioned. It could not be questioned. The medieval church did not merely offer spiritual guidance, it held a monopoly on the interpretation of reality itself. The parish priest told you why the harvest failed. The bishop told you which wars were just. The Pope told you what happened to your soul after death. There was no competing source of authority, no rival institution, no secular framework for understanding why bad things happened. If you were a peasant in 1348, the church was not one voice among many, it was the only voice. And this is the critical point, the structural vulnerability that the plague would exploit more ruthlessly than any military enemy ever could. The entire system, feudal, economic, spiritual, depended on two things: an abundance of human labor at the bottom and an unquestioned divine authority at the top. The serfs worked because they had no choice, and because the church told them their suffering was God's will. The lords profited because there were always more serfs than there was land. The church ruled because no one had a reason to doubt it, or the freedom to say so if they did. Remove either pillar, the surplus of labor or the credibility of the church, and the machine breaks. The Black Death would remove both simultaneously in 18 months. But that collapse was still in the future. In the early autumn of 1348, the machine was still running. The fields were being harvested, the tithes were being collected, the serfs were bending their backs over the same soil their grandfathers had worked. The priests were saying Mass, the lords were counting their rents, everything was functioning exactly as it had for 300 years. And somewhere in this vast, intricate, deeply unequal system, in the grain stores of London, in the cargo holds of ships from Bristol, in the straw bedding of a cramped house near the docks, the fleas were already biting. What did this world actually feel like from the inside? Not from the Lord's manor or the king's court, but from the mud, the noise, the sweat of ordinary life. To understand what the plague took, we need to walk through a single day in this city, dawn to dusk, and see it not as a historian looking backward, but as a person living through it, with no idea that it is about to end. You wake before the sun, not because you want to, but because the bells make it impossible to sleep. The nearest parish church begins ringing for matins while the sky is still black. Within minutes, another bell joins, and another, until the air is thick with overlapping iron vibrations that settle into your chest like a second heartbeat. You lie on a straw mattress that smells of mildew and sweat. The room is 10 feet by 12, shared with your wife, 2 surviving children, and on cold nights a neighbor's widow. The walls are wattle and daub. The only heat comes from a hearth with no chimney. Smoke collects against the ceiling and leaks through the thatch. Your eyes sting. They have stung every morning for as long as you can remember. You are a journeyman baker, not a master with your own shop, but a man who works in someone else's bakery for a wage set by custom and law. You earn enough to eat, most days. You pull on rough, undyed wool, splash water from a bucket filled yesterday, and step into the street. London does not have quiet mornings. Carts creak, dogs bark, a pig squeals in an alley. The lane is narrow enough to touch both sides with outstretched arms. Buildings lean inward above you, each story jutting farther than the one below, until the gap overhead barely shows the sky. The ground is unpaved mud, mixed with dung, vegetable scraps, and gutter seepage. You step over it automatically. You have been stepping over it your entire life. The bakery is a short walk, past the churchyard of St. Mary le Bow, where a beggar is already crouched against the wall. Inside, the oven has been lit since the previous night by an apprentice of 12, who sleeps beside it on the stone floor. The heat hits you, the best part of the day. You shape the loaves, slide them in on a long wooden paddle, pull them out at the right moment. Dark, dense maslin bread, wheat and rye, sometimes barley when wheat is scarce. The staple of everyone below the rank of gentlemen. It keeps you alive. It does not do much more. By the time the first loaves are done, Cheapside is transforming. The broadest street in London becomes a theater of noise, smell, and transaction. Fishmongers shout over the crowd, holding up eels and herring. Butchers display mutton on boards never quite clean. Spice merchants guard pepper and cinnamon behind locked boxes. A pound of pepper costs more than you earn in a week, passed hand to hand from the Malabar coast to Venice to this stall, worth more per ounce than silver. The crowd is dense and physical. Bodies press together. A woman argues with a fishmonger. She says his cod stinks. He says she stinks, and the crowd takes sides. A drunk falls into a candle stall. A constable shoves him into a doorway and disappears. You can read status in clothing within seconds. The wealthy wear dyed wool trimmed with fur, pointed shoes, metal-buckled belts. Craftsmen wear browns and grays. Laborers wear patched cast-offs. Beggars wear rags. Sumptuary laws dictate who may wear what, not always enforced, but their existence tells you everything about a society obsessed with keeping everyone in place. At midday, you finish your shift, paid in bread and ale. You eat on a wall beside the churchyard. The noon bell you ring from every tower, overlapping into a wall of sound that suspends conversation for 30 seconds. When they stop, the city exhales. The afternoon is yours, but you have no money. You might walk to the river to watch barges carrying wool and wine. You might stop at a tavern. The ale tastes like wet bread, which is what it is. You might attend a sermon, not from devotion, but because the church is the closest thing to entertainment. The priest warns of hellfire. You listen with half an ear. What you will not hear, what no one will hear, because the language does not exist, is any discussion of how filth connects to disease. The prevailing theory blames miasma, bad air, foul smells. This is why no one worries about the rats in the grain store, the fleas in the straw, or the open sewer running past the well from which the entire street drinks. By 4 o'clock, the light is fading. Stalls come down. Butchers sweep offal into gutters. You head home quickly. London after dark has no streetlights, no real police, and a curfew barely enforced. At home, your wife has made pottage, the same stew of beans and onions. The children eat and curl up on the straw. Your wife prays. You say nothing. You are tired in a way that has no edges. Vespers, Compline, then what passes for silence. Timber creaking, dogs barking, rats scurrying in the walls. This is your day, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow. The bread, the bells, the mud, the prayer, the straw. A cycle so ancient it feels less like a way of living and more like a law of nature. But somewhere in the darkness, something is moving that does not obey any law this world understands. It is smaller than a grain of wheat. It lives on the body of a flea,
on the body of a rat in your house. Tonight or tomorrow night, it will reach someone on your street. Within 72 hours, that person will be dead. And within a week, you will know that the rhythm of your life was never permanent at all.